Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I want us to talk about the painful truth about the complex factors that come into play when we start talking about the idea of relocating back to Zimbabwe. Because I want to believe that deep down as Zimbabweans, regardless of where you live, whether you're in the UK, US, Canada, South Africa, Australia, wherever you live right now, if you're a Zimbabwean, I know that deep down a part of you wants to go back home. But as I said, there are complex factors that come into play. And as someone who's lived in the UK for 24 plus years, I understand the conflicting emotions and feelings and thoughts that you have when you start to think about the idea of going back home. So in this video, I want us to talk about why it is that some people reject the idea of relocating back to Zimbabwe or going back to Zimbabwe, either to just go back or maybe to retire there. Whatever reasons why people reject the very idea of going back to Zimbabwe. Because right now as Zimbabweans, we're going through a lot. We're experiencing a lot of varying range of emotions. We have that. So those thoughts, feelings and emotions that you have as a Zimbabwean are valid. They are valid. Some may come in the comments saying, oh, where are the stats? Where is your proof? I don't need stats for this conversation. I am the stats. I am a Zimbabwean. I'm wearing the Zimbabwean skin. I live and breathe Zimbabwe. So I am the stats. I don't need any stats for this. So what are the reasons? The first reason is quite simple, really. It's choice. People have got a right to choose where they want to live. People have got a right to choose where they want to spend the rest of their days, the rest of their lives. So this one is a no-brainer. It doesn't need explaining. It doesn't need further exploration. It's choice. That's the first reason. The second reason is uncertainty. To me, this is like the main cause. This is where the problem lies. Uncertainty. And there are a few layers to this uncertainty, and that's what I'm going to get into. And those layers will be the other reasons. But as I said, uncertainty is like the overall problem when it comes to the idea of relocating back to Zimbabwe. The first layer is that over the years, a lot has changed. If you're someone who came to the UK or who went abroad in your teens or in your early 20s, like I did, you will find that a lot has changed over the years. Things in Zimbabwe are no longer the same. Having lived here for all these years, and even if you go back to Zimbabwe on holiday, I mean, you only spend a few weeks there and then you come back to the UK or you come back to the US, Canada or South Africa. So you don't spend, or you no longer spend that much time there. So because you've been here and you're used to life here, there's this uncertainty that comes about when you start to think about the idea of relocating back to Zimbabwe. You're wondering, how will you fare there? Because as I said, a lot has changed. Your way of life here is quite different from your way of life or when you go back to Zimbabwe. It's quite different. What it means is your coping levels have changed. Things have changed over the years. Things have changed in terms of the way life is in Zimbabwe right now. And also things have changed in you, your coping levels, because here you do things at a touch of a button. I can sit here, take my phone out and do my shopping online. I can sit here, take my phone out and do banking transaction at the touch of a button. Personally, I know and understand that my coping levels have changed. There are certain things that I used to do in Zimbabwe when I was in my teenage years or my very early 20s. There are certain things I used to be able to cope with very easily. But now, looking at myself, the way I live here in the UK, I think you might say that I've become lazy, for lack of a better word. So when I go back to Zimbabwe and I have to put in more effort to do certain things or to achieve certain things, then that causes me a bit of stress and so forth. So yeah, coping levels have changed. And to build up on that, I would say that another reason is a lack of confidence. People living in the diaspora or people living abroad no longer have the confidence when it comes to the idea of going back to Zimbabwe to live there. People are worried about things like load shedding, access to the internet, water, healthcare. They're worried about food, basic things like that. They're wondering if they go back to Zimbabwe, how would they cope or would they be able to access those things easily? Because to be fair, here in the UK or abroad, certain things are accessed very easily. And the way we do things in Zimbabwe are different. So because we're used to the way things are done here in the diaspora or abroad, then if someone is thinking about the idea of relocating back to Zimbabwe, they may start to wonder, how they will cope with things like that. Even shopping online. I mean, these days, people shop online a lot. I'm not saying that in Zimbabwe, people cannot shop online. People shop online. But the way we shop online here, or the access, or the kind of access that we have here in the UK or other countries abroad, the level of access is different. I was talking to my daughter the other day about this idea of online shopping. And I was saying to her, you know what, I think I've become very lazy nowadays, because if I want to do groceries, I just go online and do that, instead of me actually going to the shop, to the supermarket to shop. Because I think some of these things are important for us to do as human beings. Because think about the way we used to do things back home, back in the days. Because I know these days we talk about, oh, how life was great back in Zimbabwe. If you think about life back then, did we do online shopping back then? Did we have access to the internet back then? Did we have some of the things that we have here in the West? We didn't have those things, and yet we were happy. Did we have mobile phones back in the day? We didn't, but still we were happy. Because right now I know we're comparing as Zimbabweans. When we talk about our complex situation, our challenges, sometimes we compare with the way things were back in the day. But if you look at it fairly, if you want to look at things, back in the day, we didn't shop online. We didn't have mobile phones. Of course, I'm not saying that those things are not important or they're not helpful in our lives these days, or we shouldn't embrace those things that we have in the 21st century. We should, but I'm just trying to analyze things or to look at things from both sides. So if you're someone who's contemplating, this idea of relocating, and you're wondering about things like shopping online, internet, accessing the banking apps, being able to do your banking transactions online. And those things are important. We want convenience. It's nice to have that convenience. But I also want to challenge us and think about how we used to live back in the day. Of course, it's different when we talk about things like healthcare, food, those basic things that we need as people, regardless of where you live. Now, that's a different scenario. That's a different ballgame. Of course, we worry about things like that. Those things are valid. They're important in our lives. We need access to healthcare. We need food. We need those basic things. So these are the anxieties that we have as Zimbabweans when it comes to the idea of going back to Zimbabwe. We no longer have that level of confidence that we need to know that we can actually survive. We can actually thrive when we go back to Zimbabwe. Another angle as well that I want to bring into this conversation is to think about the people who are already in Zimbabwe, people who are already living in Zimbabwe, or maybe those who have relocated and now are living in Zimbabwe, or people who have never left Zimbabwe. Perhaps we need to ask ourselves, how are those people surviving in Zimbabwe? How are they living? And yes, I know the things that we talk about, and those things are valid. I don't want to use those words in this video. I'm really trying not to go into that rabbit hole. I'm really trying. And yes, I know, as I said, I know the problems, I know the challenges, but I want to also bring another side to this conversation to say that think about the people who are in Zimbabwe. How are they actually surviving? Another barrier when it comes to thinking about the idea of going back to Zimbabwe is planning, a lack of planning. Now, this one is a major one. If you're a Zimbabwean living in the diaspora or living abroad, and you have plans, or you want to go back to Zimbabwe someday, or you want to relocate back to Zimbabwe one day, then you need to plan. But because some people have reached a certain age and they want to go back home, now they're realizing, because of lack of planning, they're realizing that actually they can't. Maybe they haven't saved up. They haven't really planned for their retirement. They haven't established themselves back home in such a way that would actually allow them to live a reasonably comfortable life, a home or a business or something that would facilitate that wish that you have of going back to Zimbabwe. If you haven't been planning, or if you haven't planned properly, then that will be a hindrance. It will be a hindrance because you need to have a plan. You need to know how you're actually going to survive in Zimbabwe. How are you going to be getting your money? How are you going to be able to afford food, accommodation, all the basic things that we need to survive? Healthcare, insurance, and so forth. There are a lot of things to think about when it comes to planning. Another reason as well is reverse culture shock. Let's say for someone like me, even though I was born in Zimbabwe and I came here in my early 20s, and I know that there are some people who have lived here in the UK or in other countries abroad for longer. They came here when they were children, and now they've been here for 30, 40, 50 years. For someone like that, someone who has lived in the UK, US, Canada, Australia, Japan, wherever you are, for someone who's lived all those years abroad, that person is assimilated into the British culture, assimilated into the Australian culture, into the US way of life, wherever you live. Because when you live in a country for so long, you assimilate into the culture, you adapt that way of life, because you cannot thrive in that new country unless you learn to adapt and to adjust. So because of that, because you're now used to this way of life, when the time comes for you to relocate back to Zimbabwe, you will experience reverse culture shock, even though you were born in Zimbabwe. Because when you go back, there will be a period of readjustment, because you've spent all these years abroad. You would then need to readjust, to relearn ways of the land in Zimbabwe. You will need to readjust to the familiar but changed environment. It is a familiar environment in that you grew up in it, you were born in it, but now things have changed over the years. My last challenge is to do with the mindset. The mindset can be a real barrier when it comes to the idea of relocating back to Zimbabwe, because at the moment, Zimbabwe is a work in progress. Current work is being done, but there's still more work that needs to be done. And this goes for any country. If you go to any country, there are always things that needs more doing, things that needs to be sorted out. So I recognize that, but at the same time, if we only focus on the unfinished work, on that work that still needs to be done, and ignore the other things, positive things, things that are working for us, then in such a situation, the negative impressions will become a real barrier when it comes to the idea of relocating back to Zimbabwe. So yeah, let's talk about it. What are your opinions? What do you think about everything that I've covered in this video? If you've got something to add, then by all means, feel free to do so. I'll see you in the next video. Take care.